Welcome to another Camera Club of Brevard webinar. I hope everyone is doing well, and thanks so much for participating in our webinar tonight and all the webinars we've had. In this series of webinars, we have been studying a few basic photography composition tools and concepts, and we are on a quest to improve our photography by seeing and composing more creatively. The good news is that seeing creatively is a learned talent. It takes some practice, but anyone can create a remarkable image. As we've discussed before, composition is one of those fundamentals we must learn and practice to create remarkable images. Those of you who attended our prior webinars know that we summarize the definition of composition as how we frame our subject in our image and how we decide what to include, and most important, what to exclude from our photograph. As we capture our remarkable images, keep in mind that our goal is to encourage our viewers to linger a long time in our image. So it's important to understand and practice compositional tools and techniques that might help us engage our viewers' interest. This is the fifth webinar in a series on key components of composition. In previous webinars, we discussed the use of the rule of thirds, negative space, secondary frames, and lines. And let's continue by exploring one of the more important concepts to consider for remarkable photography, and that is shapes. Our world is made up of all kinds of shapes. Whether we are aware of it or not, shape is often the first thing that captures our attention when we are compelled to capture a scene. Almost everything we photograph has shape, although we may take them for granted. Most of the time, we are probably not composing our image with shape in mind. Many authors discuss at great length the importance and complexity of shape in photography and art. However, at the risk of oversimplifying this complex compositional concept, let's break down shape into a few easy to understand parts so we can practice thinking about shapes when we compose our remarkable images. So what exactly is shape, as it relates to photographic composition, that is? A shape in a photograph is a two-dimensional quality of an element captured. A shape does not have any appearance of depth. And often, either front or backlighting is defining the shape in a photograph. The key word here is two-dimensional. Form is the term we would use to describe an element's third dimension of depth. And typically, forms appear to have depth through lighting that creates some sort of shadow. And when we discuss shape, we are focused on the outline an element creates within our image. This outline is created by light, color, and/or textures. These outlines of contrast form lines which can impact mood and feeling of our viewers. And as we discussed in a previous webinar, these lines drive those sort of emotions. So the simplest example of a concept of shape may be the silhouette. Photographing an object in front of bright background or such as a sunrise or a brightly lit sky compels the viewer only to focus on the shape or the outline of the subject. By the way, shapes can be captured as positive shapes or negative shapes in an image. Similar to our discussion about negative space, positive shapes are created by capturing the outlines of physical objects or subjects in the scene. The tree in this image is a positive shape. Negative shapes are created by the outlines of the space surrounding our subject. The space surrounding the tree forms negative shapes. A negative shape is simply a design element created by the outlines that surround objects in our image. Before we go on, I should point out that three-dimensional objects or form in our photograph can display a clear outline also. Therefore, our photos almost always contain one or more shapes. Shapes can be very beneficial in telling our story because they convey a significant amount of information to our viewers. So think about all the information shapes provide us. We commonly identify objects, their size, their weight, their proportions, probably their interrelationships, and even emotions are conveyed by shapes. All these characteristics are interesting and meaningful to our viewers. This enables us an opportunity to create great images if we are aware of the ways we can incorporate shapes into our images. So let's explore some ideas to use shapes more thoughtfully and purposefully in unique and interesting ways. As we all know, shape often conveys the identity of a photograph object. As in the example we saw a minute ago, a silhouette of a bicycle without fail conveys the existence of a bicycle. And when photographing familiar shapes, an easy way to add visual interest is to deliberately exclude some or most of the object shape from the viewer. And this can be done by partially obstructing the shape or the subject behind other elements within our composition. Is there any doubt those are human feet in this image? And can you see the shape of the person behind the wall in your mind's eye? And what do you think they might be doing back there? We can also deliberately exclude part of our subject or an object shape by cropping part of the object outside the edge of the image frame. Either way, we are choosing to selectively exclude part of the story. We are revealing only parts of the subject by altering its shape, giving our viewers the task of completing the shape in their imagination, which may take them a little while. So if our goal is to have our viewers linger a little longer in our composition, we have achieved our goal by deliberately not giving the whole story away. The visual importance and attention-getting power of a photograph subject is directly associated to how sharply focused the subject is within the frame. However, familiar shapes and subjects blurred or capturing them out of focus forces our viewers away from all those details while transferring their attention to the shapes in the image to tell our story. We transform our subject from a literal representation to an abstract shape that once again engages our viewers' imagination to fill in all the blanks. This image is a reflection in nearby water, blurring the outlines of the buildings and people on the skywalk. I think this is a more interesting way to capture the cityscape of Copenhagen. What do you think? We can transform our subject or supporting character from a literal representation to an abstract shape by capturing the person or object that's in motion at a relatively slow shutter speed, rendering the moving object with some sort of motion blur. Once again, we engage our viewer's imagination to fill in the complete story. This image produced the motion blur with the runner going by because the shutter speed was 1/30th of a second. Here's another example of selective focus. The intentional soft focus enhanced by the fog transforms our subject and our environment from a literal representation to abstract shapes for our viewers to spend some time figuring out. Capturing this image at a 300mm focal length tends to compress the main subject with the buildings and the surf line in the background. It flattens the elements into some sort of identifiable shapes. Similar to selective focus, increasing or reducing the amount of light falling on our subject can transform it from a detailed representation to a more abstract but still recognizable shape. The most common is the basic silhouette, as we discussed, where the strong background light eliminates all the subject detail. The key is to maintain outline definition by effectively separating our subject from its background. Now, this particular image, there was an exposure compensation of plus 2/3 of a stop, capturing an image of this sort with a bright background. Generally, you have to increase your exposure compensation by somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 stop. Reducing the amount of light falling on our subject can also transform it from a detailed representation to a more abstract shape. In this image, the directional light from the top still illuminates the outline of the subject. By maintaining the outlines, viewers will still be able to recognize our subject's identity. Much like creating the silhouette, capturing the shadow cast by one or more objects is a very easy way to transform a detailed subject into a simple yet pleasing shape. Capturing well-defined shadows are very easy in our Florida landscapes, beaches, and on other flat surfaces, but maybe a little harder to find in nature photography. In this image, I saw the interesting shadow on the wall and waited until an interesting subject walked into the scene. No doubt you identified the palm tree off camera by the shape of its shadow. One primary piece of information shape can convey is size and scale. And by adjusting our perspective and/or our position relative to our subject, we can make something very big look small. Or we can control the amount of visual attention it commands in our composition, as can be seen in this photo. A very large statue of Henry Flagler in St. Augustine appears small in the image by changing perspective while shooting it through the gate, which also outlines the statue in a unique frame. Since we are conveying scale with a 2-dimensional shape of a 3-dimensional world, including a reference shape effectively conveys scale in our image. Our reference object takes on great importance in conveying our primary subject size and its visual weight in the image. In this image, you realize the grand size of the approaching storm by comparing the cloud formation to the human shape in the foreground. Also note our viewer's eye is led to the human shape by the leading lines of the shorelines. Another example where people in the photo convey the large scale of Skyline Arch in Arches National Park. Imagine for a moment this same image without the people present. Viewers may think it was just a hole in a small rock. They would have no idea of the scale. Composing with a reference shape gives us a feeling of how grand Skyline Arch really is. What do you think? Another powerful way to turn a 3-dimensional subject into a 2-dimensional shape is to photograph the subject through some sort of semi-transparent object or material. Again, rendering our subject with less detail focuses our viewer's attention on the shapes in the image to tell our story. This image was created by shooting through condensate on a storefront window. To emphasize shape in our composition, we can use extreme focal lengths to accentuate an object's outline and convey it in a unique way. Using a telephoto lens to compress distant objects, effectively flattening them in the final image, often creates outlines of distant subjects, rendering them with a little less detail, but still identifiable. magnifiable. And when I say telephoto, I mean somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 300 millimeters on a full frame camera. Additionally, getting up very close with a wide angle lens or capturing a unique mirror reflection can distort an object's shape, creating a fresh perspective to what otherwise would be a boring subject. One of the most impactful ways to harness the power of shape, and maybe the most challenging, is through metaphorical representation. And this is where we make one object look like something else. A great example is capturing an image of an object that seems to take on human form. And by the way, you can see this guy at Pineapple Park in Eau Gallie, Florida. We can imply a shape in a photo without it being physically present. By playing with the composition of objects within negative space, we can create an implied shape. A good example of this is the implied shape we probably have seen many times on social media or advertisements, is the creating of a love heart shapes with fingers and thumbs. In this image, the Post-it notes implies the negative shape of a heart in addition to the actual heart outline of the Post-it notes themselves. Here's another example of implied shapes in the negative space within the palm tree branches. The circular pie shapes looks like the webs of an umbrella to me. How about you? What do you think? Nevertheless, we can easily see the triangular shapes implied between the palm branches, which has its own shape. And by the way, you can create a star-shaped sunburst like you see in this image by setting your lens to a very small aperture, that is somewhere around f16 to f22, and position your camera so the sun specular highlight is just showing through the subject. You will find more success with this using a wide-angle lens. This image was shot at f22 with a focal length of 29 millimeters. We've reviewed the compositional concept of shape and how they may be captured, and several ideas we might consider when we incorporate them in our photography. And being aware of shapes that we include in our compositions and the information shapes convey to our viewers enables us the opportunity to turn good photos into remarkable ones. Hopefully, you now have some ideas to use shape more thoughtfully and purposefully in your images. But use your imagination. Always be open to the opportunities to combine the use of shapes with other composing tools and techniques we've discussed. Playing with the possibilities can be the difference between an ordinary good image and an extraordinary one. So have fun with shapes. I hope you practice and experiment with the many opportunities we discussed to incorporate shapes in your creative compositions. I also hope that you are inspired to experiment with all the key composition tools and techniques we have explored. I would like to end the last seminar in our composition series like we began it. As Ansel suggested, there are no rules, only remarkable images. So please consider all the composition tools and techniques we've discussed as guiding principles. Just like a musical artist must understand the fundamentals of music theory, it is important for photographic artists to understand the composition fundamentals of photography. However, use your imagination. Create your images that are unique to you, and like what you create. Share your art with others, and while you continue your journey to see more creatively every day. Thanks again for attending our Camera Club Brevard Zoom webinars. As always, keep shooting, and may only the most remarkable images be yours.